Hey there. So, the last time we talked about the Great Depression, we were really just talking about what was going on before the Great Depression happened. And we talked about the roaring 20s and how things were going really well economically. Remember that the Great Depression is kind of sandwiched in between World War One and World War Two. So, the Great Depression is going to start in the 1930s. And actually, something starts in 1929 to get it going, but the 1930s is a lot of that is when the Great Depression is happening. So today what you're going to be learning about is why did it happen? What were the causes of the Great Depression? If you have your text packet, I would recommend you keep it out and you underline for those things, the causes of the Great Depression. Okay, so here we go. Let's start reading. It says, Chapter 2, Why did the Great Depression happen? As we have seen so far, the Great Depression actually started out as a perfectly normal recession during the summer of 1929. However, there were several factors that made this normal recession become something so large and devastating, eventually leading people to call it the Great Depression. These factors were the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, the use of the gold standard, the Dust Bowl, and the actions of Presidents Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt before and during the crisis. So we're going to start with the stock market crash of October 29, 1929. As we saw earlier, the stock market was behaving very strangely during the summer of 1929. Although the prices of shares should have been going down because of the recession, the stock prices just kept going up and up. Why was this? Well, a lot had to do with the fact that investors couldn't believe that the stock market would ever stop growing. In fact, many people had begun to speculate in the stock market. What does this term speculate mean? Well, instead of standard long-term investing, it has to do with looking for a quick profit from a stock. It is when a person buys a stock one day, hoping to make a profit in a short time, and then turns around and sells it just hours or days later after the price has gone up enough. In the United States, investors began to borrow money from banks in order to speculate on stocks. This created a false value in the stock market. Even though the values of company stocks were going higher and higher, there was no real production and no profits to back up that value. It was like a bubble that was getting too big. And do you remember what happens to a bubble when it gets too big? That's right, it explodes. That's what happened with the stock market. When Americans began to take a look around, they realized that there was no reason why stocks should be so high. What's more, there was a new law about to be passed called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that would severely limit the production of large factories, which meant that profits would be even lower in the future than they were during the recession. On October 24, 1929, a huge number of stocks were traded or sold on Wall Street, and the country got scared, realizing that the whole system was very fragile. Over the weekend, newspapers all talked about, and on 5 days later, on Tuesday, October 29th, the stock market crashed. What was the result? The value of most stocks had gone down by 89%. What did that mean for the average investor? So we're going to do a little math here to find out how bad that is. It says, for example, let's say that you were a hardworking factory employee in 1929. Like many workers, you have made around $1,500 per year at your job. But like many factory employees, you may have jumped onto the bandwagon and borrowed some money to speculate in the stock market. If you decided to borrow $5,000 from a bank and then used it to speculate on $5,000 worth of stock just before the crash, what would have happened? Well, 1 week after you bought the stocks, they would have only been worth $550. You would have lost $4,450 in 1 week. That would be the same as about 3 years worth of wages at the factory. How would you ever earn that money back? How would you pay off your debt to the bank? Worse yet, as a result of the crash of the stock market, many factories were forced to lay off their employees, which meant that they couldn't pay back the money they owed to the banks. Because of this, some people lost their homes, their cars, everything they owed, and they were left with nothing. The Great Depression had begun. So we just talked about the stock market crashing. The next cause of the Great Depression is the use of the gold standard. So another factor that made the Great Depression so strong and so devastating was the gold standard. Do you know what the gold standard was? Well, in order to understand what the gold standard was, we have to understand a little bit about where money comes from. Money in the United States is printed by a central bank called the Federal Reserve. They are in charge of determining how much money is printed and how much the money is worth. After all, if there is too much money floating around, then each dollar will have less buying power. A soda, instead of costing $1, might cost 5. The Federal Reserve has always tried very hard to make sure that they do their job well. For many years, the Federal Reserve only printed money based on the amount of gold that was kept in its storehouse. For example, dollars were originally printed with the words gold coin on them. This was to show that each bit of currency in the national economy was backed up by something real and valuable, gold. It also made it clear that U.S. currency could be exchanged at a local bank at any time for real gold coins. Other countries around the world that wanted to do business with the United States had to do the same thing. They had to make sure that their currency was backed up by the gold that they had in their storehouse. If there was no more gold, then no more money could be printed. That way, it would be easy to trade with the other countries because their money would be all similar in value. However, when people began to get worried about the value of the country's currency, they would go to their local bank and said, "Take your paper money bank and give me my gold." Then they would hide the gold until they thought the economy had gotten through the recession. However, what would have happened if everyone in every country got really scared and didn't trust the government anymore? What would have happened if everyone wanted their gold back at the same time? Well, we found out in 1929. When nations around the world saw the United States economy was failing, it began to affect theirs also. After all, much of their business depended on buying and selling with Americans. Citizens everywhere began to demand gold for their currency, which put banks in a bad position. The gold standard had been a method used by governments to stabilize the value of their currency, but it also meant that governments couldn't print any more money if there was a need unless they found more gold somewhere. When citizens lost confidence in the banks and take all their money away, the government couldn't do anything about it and would go broke, not even having enough money to keep the basic programs functioning. That is what happened during the Great Depression. The gold standard made it more difficult to get money into the economy and dragged other nations down with the United States. So now we're causing, as a country, the other countries in the world to also go into a depression. The third cause of the depression is the Dust Bowl, and it is exactly what it sounds like, lots of dust. So here we go, let's find out what it was. I want you to also be listening for what caused the Dust Bowl. Not only is the Dust Bowl a cause of the Great Depression, but what actually caused the Dust Bowl to happen. So you might want to underline those things too. Life during the Great Depression was tough enough for people who had been working in factories and who had been living in the big city. They found themselves with no jobs and with no money to pay back their debts. However, people living in the Midwest, mainly farmers, had a difficult time too. Their problems came from a severe drought during the mid 1930s. What made this drought so different? Before settlers moved west during the 1800s, different types of grass and small plants had kept the topsoil from blowing away in the strong winds that roll over the plains in the Midwest, in places like Oklahoma. These plants and grasses had even held on to water in times of drought. However, as farmers began to try to take advantage of every square inch of land that was available to them, they pulled out all of the grass and little plants to make more room for crops. What's more, they never gave the land a rest from one season to the next. They just kept planting and harvesting, planting and harvesting. As a result, when the drought came, the land literally just disappeared. It blew away in the wind. The storms were called dust storms, and they severely damaged the farmland of the Midwest during the 1930s, making life impossible for farmers and agricultural workers. This time period came to be called the Dust Bowl and made many farmers leave their farms and move to other states and cities to try to find work. In the picture at the top, you can see how tall the amount of dust is. It's up the side of the car there, it's up the side of the buildings. The wagon wheels are almost completely buried. So that's how much dust had blown and dirt had blown into these farmlands. The fourth cause of the Great Depression has to do with what the presidents were doing. So it says the actions of President Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt before and during the crisis. Although each of these men tried their best to make the right decisions during a difficult time, they each ended up making the normal recession of 1929 turn into a 10-year Great Depression. So in other words, you guys, it was worse because of the things they did. And the thing is, they didn't mean to like cause worse problems. Their intention was to make it better, but by the things they did, they actually made it worse. So let's listen to what they did. President Herbert Hoover was the first to contribute to the problem. In May 1929, he had to decide whether or not to sign into law a bill that had just been passed by Congress called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. What was the purpose of this bill? It would add a tariff, which is an extra fee, kind of like a tax, to any products imported from other countries. The goal was to protect American workers from foreign competition by making it more difficult to import and purchase foreign-made goods. The price on some items rose by over 60%. As an example, a car made in Germany that normally sold for $2,000 would now sell for $3,200, with the government getting the extra money. Why do we say that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act contributed to the Depression? Well, when Herbert Hoover signed the bill into law on June 17, 1930, the Great Depression had already begun. However, by signing this bill, Hoover made other trading partners like Canada, Britain, France, and Germany very angry. They felt that they were being discriminated against and that no one would buy their products anymore. In a kind of revenge, these other nations all passed legislation or laws putting tariffs on American made goods. So basically, they did the same thing back to us. As a result, American factories suffered because no one in other countries would buy their products. As we see, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act ended up being a very bad thing. Yes, by trying to help American workers, it actually ended up hurting them. So now let's move on to what FDR did, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt also committed his share of errors. When a recession or a depression hits an economy, the most important thing is to spend money and to get people working. Even though it sounds strange, because most people think that saving money is the most important thing during a recession. Spending money is what creates jobs, which in turn creates more money, which creates more jobs, etc. So, the federal government should have been spending lots of money in order to help the nation. Although a lot of programs were created to help Americans, as we will see later, not enough money was spent, and America still decided to stick to the gold standard, which made it harder to pay off old debts. Although these situations would later be corrected, President Roosevelt, by not taking the correct action soon enough, helped to make the Great Depression worse than it had to be. Now that we understand a little more about what led up to the Great Depression, let's see what actually happened during it. So we will learn that later on in the week, but this is what you need to do now. List 4 causes of the Great Depression. They list 4 in the reading. Go back in the text and look. And then list 3 causes of the Dust Bowl. What were 3 things that made the Dust Bowl happen? The next thing you'll do is watch a short video called Almanac Dust Bowl, and I want you to tell me what you saw or learned that surprised you. You must fill this in. Don't tell me that nothing surprised you. And then on the last slide, you need to watch the video, The Dust Bowl Episodes Uncovering the Dust Bowl. Again, tell me what did you see or learn that surprised you. Please make sure, again, that you go back in the reading if you have trouble finding answers to those 2 questions about the causes of the Great Depression and the causes of the Dust Bowl. Please make sure you check over and that you've done all of your best work, and have a great day.